You are nothing but trash.
Or that she had been collecting every single one of his crimes was the dark.
The continuous, high-pitched wail of a flatlining heart monitor is a sound that strips away titles, wealth, and arrogance. It is the great equalizer. Inside VIP Treatment Room 1 at St. Jude's Medical Center, that sound was currently tearing through the sterile air, sounding very much like the end of the world. On the oversized hospital bed lay 7-year-old Leo Sterling. His skin, usually flush with the rosy hue of childhood, was an alarming shade of cyanotic blue. His small chest hitched in violent, irregular spasms. Around him, a chaotic storm of highly paid medical professionals buzzed like trapped flies. "Push another milligram of epinephrine now," barked Dr. Arthur Evans, the chief of emergency medicine. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down his temple to soak into the collar of his pristine, custom-tailored white coat. His hands that were insured for millions, were trembling. "Doctor, his blood pressure is still tanking. The epi isn't working. His airway is swelling," a panicked nurse called out over the blaring alarms. "Do it again. It's severe anaphylaxis. Prepare to intubate," Evans ordered, his voice cracking with a hysteria that no leader should ever show in a trauma bay. He snatched a pre-filled syringe of epinephrine from the crash cart, uncapping it with his teeth. He was desperate. If the sole heir to the Sterling Empire died on his table, his career wouldn't just be over. It would be buried. In the far corner of the expansive room, completely ignored by the frantic medical team, stood a ghost. Clara wore the faded, shapeless navy blue scrubs of the hospital's overnight janitorial staff. She held a heavy mop, the soapy water dripping rhythmically into the yellow plastic bucket beside her. To Dr. Evans and his team, she was invisible. A piece of the furniture, a necessary nuisance meant to clean up the blood and vomit after the real work was done. But Clara was not looking at the floor. Her dark, observant eyes were locked on the dying child. She saw what the panicked chief of medicine was entirely missing. She saw the faint, crescent-shaped rash blooming behind the boy's left ear. She noted the rigid, unnatural stiffening of his jaw muscles. And underneath the overpowering smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile iodine, her trained senses caught the faintest, unmistakable scent hovering over the boy's mouth: bitter almonds. Dr. Evans raised the needle, aiming for the boy's thigh. Clara dropped the mop. The wooden handle hit the linoleum floor with a sharp clack. In 3 silent, impossibly swift strides, the invisible janitor crossed the room. Just as Dr. Evans thrust his hand downward, a rough, calloused hand shot out from the periphery and clamped around his wrist like a steel vise. The force of the grip was so sudden and absolute that Evans gasped, the needle halting a mere inch from the boy's skin. "Are you out of your mind?" Evans roared, his face turning a mottled crimson as he looked up. He expected a rogue nurse, a hysterical family member. Instead, he saw a faded blue uniform and hands smelling of industrial bleach. "Get your filthy hands off me, security. Drag this trash out of here. He's in anaphylactic shock." Clara did not blink. She did not raise her voice. Her grip on his wrist did not loosen a fraction of a millimeter. Her eyes, cold and sharp as a surgical, bored directly into his panicked soul. "If you push that epinephrine into his system, his heart will stop beating in exactly 30 seconds, Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, a low, resonant baritone that cut through the hysteria of the room like glass. "Security." Evans screamed again, trying to yank his arm away. He couldn't. The janitor's grip was immovable. "This is not anaphylaxis," Clara continued, her tone authoritative, rhythmic and commanding. It was a voice used to giving life and death orders. "Look at the crescent rash behind the mastoid bone. Smell the bitter almonds on his breath. He's tachycardic with impending ventricular fibrillation. This is acute oleander poisoning." The room froze. The nurses stared wide-eyed, completely paralyzed by the sheer authority radiating from the woman in the cleaning uniform. "You have less than a minute," Clara stated, finally releasing Evans's wrist with a slight shove of disgust. She pointed a wet, cracked finger toward the crash cart. "Push 50 milligrams of digoxin-specific fab intravenously. Now, if you waste another 30 seconds yelling at me, the billionaire waiting out in the hallway is going to be paying for a child-sized casket instead of a new hospital wing." For a split second, ego battled with raw fear in Dr. Evans's eyes. He looked at the boy. He saw the rash. He caught the faint scent. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been completely, catastrophically wrong. "Get the digibind." "Stat." Evans screamed at the nurses, his voice cracking. The room exploded into a different kind of motion, focused, directed, saving. The antidote was pulled from the emergency lockbox. A nurse pushed the medication through the boy's IV line. 10 seconds passed. It felt like an hour, 20 seconds. Then the chaotic, screeching wail of the monitor broke. It stuttered, skipped, and finally settled into a fast but steady, rhythmic beep. Beep, beep. The cyanotic blue began to recede from little Leo's lips, replaced by the faint, fragile pink of returning oxygen. His chest rose and fell in a natural, unforced rhythm. The boy was alive. A collective breath left the room. A nurse slumped against the counter, silently crying into her hands. Dr. Evans braced his hands on the bed rails, his head hanging between his shoulders as he took ragged, shaking breaths. He had almost killed the most important patient in the hospital, and he had been saved by a woman who cleaned the toilets. The sheer humiliation of it burned through his veins, quickly morphing into a toxic, defensive rage. He spun around, his face purple with fury. Clara had not stayed to watch the miracle. She had already retreated to the corner of the room. She calmly picked up her mop handle from the floor, dipped it into the soapy water, and began to rhythmically wipe away the scuff marks the frantic doctors had left on the linoleum. "You," Evans hissed, marching toward her, his finger pointing like a loaded weapon. "Who the hell do you think you are? You barge in here, contaminating a sterile VIP trauma bay with your garbage? You could have killed him." Clara continued to mop. Swish, she didn't even look up. Her silence only fueled his rage. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, you minimum wage piece of trash. You think because you watch medical dramas on TV you can play doctor? You're a liability. You're fired. Get your cart, strip off those scrubs, and get out of my hospital before I have you arrested for medical assault." Clara squeezed the mop in the wringer, squeak. The dirty water flushed down into the bucket. Inside her chest, a familiar, agonizing fire burned. 5 years ago, a man just like Evans, arrogant, incompetent, and deeply insecure, had stood over her and stripped her of her life. She knew the mechanics of male fragility in the medical field better than anyone. If she spoke now, if she defended herself, it would only give him the satisfaction of a fight. She had lost too much to lose her temper. She was playing a long, dangerous game, and she could not afford to break cover. Not yet. Without a single word of defense, without a tear, and without a trace of anger on her stoic face, Clara simply nodded. She grabbed the handle of her yellow cleaning cart and began to turn toward the exit, her dignity intact, her silence a massive, impenetrable wall. Before she could take a step, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay flew open with enough force to crack the hinges. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard Sterling stepped into the room. He was a man who did not just enter a space. He occupied it entirely. Dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his silver-streaked hair swept back, he radiated absolute, terrifying power. He was a man who bought and sold politicians before breakfast. Behind him stood 2 massive men in tactical suits, his personal security. "My son," Richard demanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that demanded immediate obedience. Dr. Evans practically tripped over his own feet as he rushed forward, his face instantly transforming from a mask of rage to a sickeningly sweet portrait of professional reassurance. "Mr. Sterling, thank God you're here. Please, don't worry." It was incredibly touch and go for a moment. Evans lied smoothly, gesturing to the monitor. "Leo went into acute cardiac distress due to an incredibly rare toxin. But through my team's rapid intervention and my specific diagnostic protocols, we administered the exact antidote just in time. He is stabilized. He is going to be perfectly fine." Richard brushed past the doctor without acknowledging his existence. He walked to the side of the bed, his imposing frame suddenly looking incredibly vulnerable as he reached out a large, trembling hand to stroke his son's pale forehead. Leo stirred slightly, letting out a soft sigh, leaning into his father's touch. Richard closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, breathing out a prayer to a God he rarely spoke to. "Thank you," Richard whispered to the room at large. He turned to look at Dr. Evans, who was preening under the assumed praise. "I will make sure this hospital is heavily compensated for saving my boy, Dr. Evans. It's my duty and my privilege, Mr. Sterling." Evans smiled, oozing false humility. "We pride ourselves on having the best hands in the country. Now if you'll excuse the mess, we are just in the process of having this disruptive janitor removed." He shot a venomous glare at Clara, who was quietly pushing her cart toward the door. Richard Sterling turned his gaze. He possessed the eyes of an apex predator, eyes trained to see the flaws in billion-dollar contracts, the tells of lying CCOs, and the hidden truths in any room. His eyes landed on Leo's arm. Specifically, he looked at the IV line inserted into the delicate pediatric vein near the boy's wrist. It wasn't taped down with the standard, rushed medical tape job. It was secured using a highly complex crisscross chevron technique, a method used specifically by microsurgeons to ensure absolute stability in moving patients. Richard's gaze shifted to the stainless steel tray beside the bed. The heavy medical forceps hadn't been thrown down haphazardly. They were placed perfectly parallel, the tips pointing downward to maintain the sterile field, an instinct ingrained only by thousands of hours in an operating theater. Finally, Richard looked at Dr. Evans. He saw the doctor's shaking hands, the sweat stains, the panicked dilation of his pupils. This was a man recovering from a near miss, not a hero basking in a victory. Richard's eyes slowly moved to the door. He watched the back of the woman in the faded blue scrubs as she quietly, almost invisibly, slipped out of the trauma room, pushing her squeaky yellow cart. He had seen the way she held her shoulders. It wasn't the slump of a defeated laborer. It was the rigid, perfect posture of someone accustomed to standing over an operating table for 12 hours straight. "Dr. Evans," Richard said softly. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, get out." Evans blinked. "Excuse me? Sir, I need to monitor the patients." I said, "Get out of my sight." Richard's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "You didn't save my son, you were going to kill him. I can smell the panic on you from 3 feet away." Evans opened his mouth to argue, but the 2 security guards stepped forward, their hands resting casually on their belts. The doctor swallowed hard, his face pale, and scurried out of the room like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. The room fell into a quiet, sacred silence, save for the steady beep of Leo's heart monitor. Richard pulled up a chair and sat beside his son. He held the small, fragile hand in his. For a long time he just watched the boy breathe, the terror of the past hour slowly uncoiling in his chest. Then, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a single number. It was answered on the first ring. "Marcus," Richard spoke to his head of intelligence. "I need you to pull the security footage for VIP room 1 from the last 20 minutes. "Is there a problem, sir?" "No, a miracle," Richard replied, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he stared at the perfectly tied chevron knot on his son's IV line. "I want you to find out everything there is to know about the janitor who was assigned to this floor tonight. Pull her background, her employment history, her financials, everything." "A janitor, sir?" "She was wearing a janitor's uniform," Richard corrected quietly, a cold, calculating spark igniting in his eyes. "But the woman who just walked out of this room has the hands of a master surgeon. Find her." The industrial bleach burned the microcuts on Clara's hands as she washed them in the tiny, rust-stained sink of her studio apartment. It was a sharp, biting pain, but she welcomed it. Physical pain was easy, it was predictable. It was the phantom pains of the heart that were unbearable. She dried her hands on a threadbare towel and walked over to the single luxury in her bleak, windowless room, a small silver-framed photograph sitting on a wobbly bedside table. In the picture, a little girl with bright hazel eyes and a missing front tooth was laughing, her arms thrown joyously around a woman in a pristine white doctor's coat. Clara traced the glass over her daughter's face. Lily, she was 7 now, the same age as the billionaire's boy she had saved just hours ago. But Clara hadn't seen her daughter's face in person for 1,825 days. 5 years since the world knew her as Clara Vance, the golden hands of pediatric surgery at St. Jude's Medical Center. She had been brilliant, fiercely dedicated, and hopelessly naive. She had believed that saving lives was enough, ignoring the toxic political underbelly of the hospital board, and more importantly, ignoring the calculating ambition of her own husband. Victor Vance had never been half the doctor Clara was, but he possessed a dark genius for manipulation and corporate ladder climbing. When a high-profile, highly experimental surgery on a wealthy donor's child went catastrophically wrong, a failure resulting entirely from Victor bypassing safety protocols to fast-track untested, heavily kickbacked medical equipment, he needed a scapegoat. He didn't just throw his wife under the bus. He engineered a masterpiece of destruction. Victor had forged her signature on the equipment requisition forms. He had altered the patient's charts post-mortem. With the hospital board heavily invested in Victor's lucrative corporate partnerships, they gladly looked the other way. He hired the most ruthless corporate sharks in the city to dismantle her in court. In a matter of months, Clara lost her medical license, her reputation, and her life savings in legal fees. But the final lethal blow was custody. Using her sudden crushing depression and the fabricated medical negligence charges against her, Victor convinced a judge that Clara was an unstable, dangerous mother. He took Lily. He took everything. Victor was now the chief executive director of St. Jude's. Clara was a ghost, pushing a mop through the very hallways she used to rule, working a minimum wage job under an assumed maiden name, paying off a mountain of court-ordered debt just to keep out of prison. But Victor had made one fatal miscalculation. He thought he had broken her spirit. He didn't realize that when you strip a mother of her child and push her into the dark, she doesn't go blind. She learns how to see in the shadows. The fluorescent lights of the hospital's administrative wing buzzed with a harsh, unforgiving glare. It was Tuesday, 3 days after the incident in the trauma bay. Clara was methodically running her mop over the Italian marble floors outside the executive suites. The double mahogany doors swung open, and the sound of expensive leather shoes echoed in the hallway. "The Sterling Foundation's audit is a formality, darling," a smooth baritone voice purred. "Richard Sterling is a businessman. He doesn't care about the ethics of our billing department, he cares about the tax write-off. Once he signs that $100 million endowment on Friday, I am untouchable." Clara kept her head down, her mop moving in perfectly rhythmic figure eights, but her knuckles turned white around the wooden handle. Victor Vance strode down the hall, looking like the cover of a medical executive magazine in a bespoke $5,000 suit. Clinging to his arm was Evelyn, the hospital's VP of operations, and the woman Victor had been sleeping with in Clara's own bed for 2 years before the divorce. Evelyn wore a tight crimson designer dress and towering stilettos that clicked sharply against the marble. They walked right past Clara. To Victor, the janitor in the faded blue uniform wasn't even a human being, she was part of the architecture. But Evelyn, whose insecurity ran as deep as her cruelty, always seemed to possess a sixth sense for making those beneath her suffer. As they passed Clara's cleaning cart, Evelyn abruptly stopped. She held a steaming, extra-large caramel macchiato in her manicured hand. With a deliberate, theatrical flick of her wrist, Evelyn tipped the cup. The dark, sticky liquid splashed violently onto the freshly mopped marble, splattering against the toes of Clara's worn-out rubber work shoes. "Oh goodness," Evelyn gasped, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Slippery cup, you missed a spot right there, sweetie. Try to be a little more useful, would you?" Victor didn't even break his stride. He merely glanced back, his lip curling in disgust at the sight of the spilled coffee. "Leave it, Evelyn. They get paid to clean our messes. Let's go. We have the caterers for the gala waiting." Evelyn smirked, her eyes meeting Clara's for a fraction of a second, waiting for the reaction. Waiting for the lower-class worker to snap, to yell, to give Evelyn an excuse to have her fired. Clara stood perfectly still. The hot coffee soaked through her socks, burning her toes. The urge to wrap the heavy wet mop around Evelyn's perfectly styled neck was a physical agonizing pressure in her chest. But a surgeon never acts on impulse. A surgeon waits for the exact perfect moment to make the incision. Clara slowly lowered her eyes to the floor. She dropped to her hands and knees. Pulling a microfiber cloth from her belt, she began to silently, methodically wipe up the sticky mess at Evelyn's feet. Evelyn chuckled, a hollow, victorious sound. "Good girl," she murmured, before turning on her heel and strutting after Victor. Clara remained on her knees, scrubbing the floor until it gleamed. She swallowed the humiliation, digesting it, turning it into pure, unadulterated fuel. Let them think she was defeated. Let them think she was deaf and blind. It only made it easier to walk right past their security doors and access the shredder bins containing the hospital's darkest financial secrets. At 2:00 a.m., the air in the hospital's underground loading dock was bitter and biting. Clara threw the last heavy black trash bag into the industrial dumpster, the satisfying thud echoing in the concrete cavern. She turned to go back inside when the blinding glare of LED headlights pinned her against the brick wall. A sleek jet-black Maybach had silently rolled into the loading dock, blocking her only exit. The engine purred like a sleeping panther. The driver's side door opened, and a massive security guard stepped out, but a voice from the back seat stopped him. "Stay in the car, Marcus. I will handle this." The rear door swung open. Richard Sterling stepped out into the freezing air. He wore a heavy charcoal overcoat, his silver hair catching the harsh security lights. He didn't look like a grieving father tonight. He looked like an emperor surveying his territory. He walked slowly toward Clara, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her faded blue scrubs, her wet shoes, the cheap plastic ID badge pinned to her chest that read, "Claire Environmental Services." "It's a remarkably long way to fall, isn't it?" Richard said, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the concrete. "From the youngest chief of pediatric surgery in the state to emptying bedpans in the basement. Good evening, Dr. Clara Vance." Clara did not flinch. She had known this moment was coming the second she touched his son's IV line. You do not correct a chief of medicine in front of a billionaire without inviting extreme scrutiny. My shift ends in 10 minutes, Mr. Sterling. If you're going to report me to administration for practicing medicine without a license, I'd appreciate it if you did it quickly. The buses stop running at 3. A faint, genuine smile touched the corner of Richard's mouth. It was a predator recognizing another predator. He reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a heavy wax stamp. He held it out to her. I am not a man who believes in coincidences, Dr. Vance. I read the background report my team compiled on you. I read the court transcripts of your malpractice trial. I also had 3 independent medical experts review the surgical logs from 5 years ago. Richard took a step closer, his eyes intense. They all concluded the same thing: you were framed. You took the fall for a massive systemic failure orchestrated by your ex-husband. Clara stared at the envelope, her heart hammering a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs. In this envelope, Richard continued, is a cashier's check for $5 million. Tax-free. Untraceable. It is a gesture of my profound gratitude for saving Leo's life. Take it, Clara. Hire the best lawyers in the country. Get your daughter back. Move to Europe and start over. Leave this wretched place behind. $5 million. For a woman who had spent the last week deciding between paying for electricity or buying fresh vegetables, it was a sum that shattered reality. It was freedom. It was Lily. Clara looked at the envelope. Then she looked up into Richard Sterling's piercing eyes. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed his hand away. Richard blinked, genuine shock registering on his features. In his entire life, no one had ever pushed away $5 million. I don't want your money, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, her voice dropping to a register of pure, chilling resolve. Are you insane? Richard asked, his brow furrowing. This is your way out. A check is an apology. I don't want an apology. I want a reckoning. Clara stepped closer, closing the distance between them, completely unfazed by his wealth or his power. I know why you're here at this hospital. Victor bragged about it loudly enough. You are preparing to sign a $100 million endowment on Friday night at the anniversary gala. You are going to hand Victor Vance the keys to a kingdom. Richard's eyes narrowed. Victor Vance is a means to an end. My foundation needs a flagship medical center. He is merely the administrator. He is a parasite, Clara corrected, her voice dripping with quiet, lethal conviction. And if you give him that money, he will bleed your foundation dry, just like he bled his patients, just like he bled me. He doesn't care about medicine. He only cares about power. Richard studied her. He saw the fire burning behind her dark eyes, a fire fueled by 5 years of silence, 5 years of scrubbing floors, 5 years of maternal agony. What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Vance? Richard asked quietly. You offered me $5 million to walk away, Clara said, her chin lifting, shedding the invisible weight of the janitor's uniform, standing once again as the brilliant commanding surgeon she truly was. I am asking you to keep your money. I don't want your check, Richard. I want to borrow your sword. The billionaire went perfectly still. I want you to let me stand beside you at that gala on Friday night, Clara demanded, the cold night air turning her breath into white smoke. I want access to the main stage. I want 5 minutes of the media's attention. I want to walk into the brightest room in this city and cut his throat in front of the entire world. For a long, tense moment, the only sound in the loading dock was the low hum of the Maybach's engine. Then, slowly, Richard Sterling began to smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who appreciated the exquisite beauty of absolute calculated destruction. He slipped the envelope back into his overcoat. Well then, Dr. Vance, Richard murmured, his eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. We had better go shopping. A surgeon can't be seen at a gala wearing scrubs. There is a superpower in being poor and wearing a uniform. It is the superpower of absolute invisibility. For 5 years, Clara Vance had navigated the gleaming corridors of St. Jude's Medical Center as a ghost. Doctors, board members, and executives walked past her as if she were a piece of drywall. They did not lower their voices when she emptied their trash cans. They did not close their laptops when she dusted their mahogany desks. They left passwords written on yellow sticky notes attached to their monitors, assuming the woman pushing the mop was too uneducated to understand what the string of letters and numbers meant. They forgot that before she held a mop, she had held human hearts in her hands. It was 1:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. The administrative wing on the top floor was a tomb of silence save for the low, rhythmic hum of Clara's industrial vacuum. She was currently in the office of Evelyn Vance, the VP of operations and the woman who had stolen her husband. The room smelled of expensive, cloying gardenia perfume. Clara switched off the vacuum and walked over to Evelyn's recycling bin. Most corporate criminals are arrogant, but Victor and Evelyn were also exceptionally lazy. They relied on standard cross-cut shredders, believing the thin strips of paper were enough to bury their sins. But a pediatric surgeon possesses a level of meticulous patience that borders on the obsessive. For a woman who had spent 12-hour shifts reattaching microscopic blood vessels in premature infants, reassembling shredded documents was child's play. Clara pulled a thick, clear plastic bag from the bin, swapping it for a fresh one. She slipped the bag of shredded evidence into the hidden compartment of her yellow janitorial cart right beneath the extra rolls of paper towels. Over the past 3 days, since her midnight meeting with Richard Sterling, Clara had barely slept. Her small apartment had become a war room. Every night she sat on her worn linoleum floor, using tweezers and clear tape to piece together the shredded remains of Victor's empire. What she found was sickening, even for him. Victor and Evelyn weren't just taking kickbacks from pharmaceutical reps, they were actively siphoning money from the St. Jude's Pediatric Leukemia Fund. They were routing donations meant for dying children into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under Evelyn's maiden name. It was the perfect, despicable crime. And it was exactly the kind of weapon Richard Sterling needed to obliterate them. But financial ruin wasn't enough for Clara. Victor had taken her daughter. She needed the one thing that would put him in a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. She needed the original surgical logs from 5 years ago. At 2:30 a.m., Clara pushed her cart into the third-floor staff break room. It was completely deserted. She locked the door behind her, her heart rate accelerating slightly. She pulled a cheap prepaid burner phone from her pocket. She stared at the keypad, her thumb hovering over the numbers she knew by heart, but hadn't dared to dial in over a year. Her custody agreement stipulated she was allowed 1 supervised phone call a month, but Victor always found a way to sabotage it. Lily is at piano practice. Lily is sleeping. Lily doesn't want to talk to you. He controlled the narrative, poisoning her daughter's mind, painting Clara as a deranged, negligent woman who had abandoned her. But Clara knew the schedule of the Vance household better than Victor did. She knew that every Wednesday at 2:30 a.m., Victor was usually deeply asleep, and Evelyn was prone to leaving her cell phone downstairs. More importantly, she knew Lily had a habit of waking up from night terrors around this time, sneaking down to the kitchen for a glass of water. Clara dialed the house landline. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Please," Clara prayed, squeezing her eyes shut. On the 4th ring there was a soft click. "Hello?" A small, trembling voice whispered through the receiver. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The sound of her daughter's voice was a physical blow, a sudden, sharp ache that radiated from her chest down to her fingertips. Lily sounded older, her voice losing that round, toddler-like cadence. "Lily, sweetheart?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Mommy?" A single tear spilled over Clara's eyelashes, tracking through the fine dust on her cheek. "Yes, baby, it's Mommy." "I'm here. How are you, my sweet girl?" "Mommy." Lily's voice broke into a quiet, desperate sob. "I miss you. Why can't you come see me? Daddy says you're sick in your head and you don't want me." The rage that flared inside Clara was apocalyptic, but she forced her voice to remain a soft, soothing blanket. "Daddy is lying, Lily. I want you more than anything in this entire world. I think about you every single minute of every single day. I love you so much." "Evelyn locked me out of the kitchen," Lily cried softly, sniffing. "I had a bad dream, but she told me to stop crying because I was ruining her beauty sleep. She threw away the drawing I made for you." Clara gripped the edge of the break room counter, her knuckles turning white. She imagined Evelyn's perfect, smiling face, and the urge to cause physical violence was a living, breathing thing inside her. "Listen to me, Lily. You are the bravest girl I know," Clara said, her voice fiercely steady. "I need you to be brave for just a little while longer. I am coming for you. I promise you, I am coming to get you and we are going to be together. Okay? Really? I have never broken a promise to you, have I?" Before Lily could answer, there was a sharp, aggressive click on the line. Someone had picked up the extension upstairs. "Who is this?" Victor's harsh, sleep-heavy voice barked into the phone. "Lily, why are you on the phone?" "Daddy, it's Mommy," Lily said, her voice spiking with innocent hope. "Lily, hang up the phone and go to your room." "Now," Victor commanded, his tone dripping with the kind of quiet menace that made children freeze. "But," Now, there was a faint clatter as Lily dropped the receiver, followed by the sound of her small, hurried footsteps retreating upstairs. Clara closed her eyes, breathing through her nose. "You have a lot of nerve, Clara," Victor sneered through the receiver, his voice dropping into a cruel, mocking whisper. "Violating a court order? Calling my house in the middle of the night? You must really want to go to jail." "She was crying, Victor," Clara said, her voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she used when declaring a time of death. "Evelyn is neglecting her." Victor let out a short, arrogant laugh. "Evelyn is 100 times the mother you ever were. Look at yourself, Clara. You're a minimum-wage janitor. You scrub the toilets I use. You're a pathetic, broken piece of trash. If you ever call this house again, I will have my lawyers file a restraining order, so fast it'll make your head spin. You will never see her again. Do you understand me?" He was waiting for her to break. He was waiting for the hysterical sobs, the begging, the desperate pleas of a shattered mother. It was how he fed his ego. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at her reflection in the dark window of the break room. She didn't look broken. She looked like a soldier standing on the edge of a battlefield. "Make sure she eats her vegetables, Victor," Clara said, her voice chillingly even. "And tell Evelyn to watch her step. The floors at the hospital have been very slippery lately." Without waiting for his response, she disconnected the call. She popped the back off the burner phone, pulled out the SIM card and snapped it in half, dropping the pieces into the trash. The sadness was gone. The heartbreak had evaporated. All that remained was cold, surgical precision. It was time to cut the cancer out. At 3:45 a.m., Clara stood outside the heavy oak doors of the chief executive's office. Security patrols passed this corridor exactly every 45 minutes. She had a 30-minute window. She slid her master custodial key into the lock. It clicked softly and she slipped inside, letting the heavy door shut without a sound. Victor's office was a monument to his own narcissism. Dark mahogany, leather Chesterfield sofas, and a wall of framed degrees and awards he had barely earned. Clara bypassed the desk. She knew exactly where he kept his secrets. Behind a large abstract oil painting on the far wall was a hidden wall safe. It wasn't a modern digital keypad. Victor was old school and deeply paranoid about hackers. It was a heavy steel biometric dial safe. A Sargent & Greenleaf 8500. To a common thief it was impenetrable without a drill or explosives. But Clara was not a common thief. She pulled a pair of ultra-thin, sterile blue nitrile surgical gloves from her pocket and snapped them onto her hands. The thin latex clung to her skin like a second layer, heightening her tactile sensitivity rather than dulling it. She stepped up to the safe and placed the fingertips of her right hand lightly on the cold steel dial. She closed her eyes. A pediatric surgeon relies on touch as much as sight. When operating on an infant's chest cavity, a surgeon must be able to feel the microscopic pulse of a vessel, the subtle resistance of healthy tissue versus a tumor, the nearly imperceptible click of a micro-clamp locking into place. Her hands were calibrated to detect vibrations that most humans could not even register. She began to turn the dial slowly to the right. The steel mechanism purred beneath her fingertips. She tuned out the hum of the HVAC system, the distant wail of an ambulance siren outside. She narrowed her entire universe down to the pads of her index and middle fingers. Spin, spin, spin. Her fingers felt a microscopic drag, a tiny internal metallic hesitation. The first wheel picking up the drive pin, she reversed direction. Spin, spin. There, a faint, almost silent click vibrated through the latex glove and into her nerve endings. It was the sound of the fence dropping into the gate of the tumblers. Number 42, she repeated the process, her breathing shallow and controlled. 5 years of scrubbing floors had not dulled her hands. The repetitive physical labor had only made her grip stronger, her hands steadier. Number 17. She turned the dial one last time, feeling for the final drop click. Number 85. Clara grasped the heavy steel handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. Inside, stacked neatly on the top shelf, were stacks of $100 bills, velvet jewelry boxes, and a loaded silver revolver. Clara ignored all of it. She reached for the bottom shelf, pulling out a battered, black, leather-bound notebook. It was his personal surgical log. The one from 5 years ago. Clara flipped it open, her eyes scanning the dates until she found the night of the botched surgery. There, in Victor's own distinct, hurried handwriting, was the original account. It detailed his authorization of the faulty equipment. It detailed his instructions to bypass the safety checks. It was the exact opposite of the forged document he had presented to the medical board to destroy her. He hadn't destroyed the original. He was too arrogant. He had kept it as an insurance policy, a trophy of his own invincibility. Clara pulled a miniature high-resolution camera from her pocket, provided by Richard Sterling's intelligence team, and photographed every single page, the flash illuminating the dark office in quick, sharp bursts of white light. When she was finished, she placed the notebook exactly where she found it. She closed the heavy steel door, spinning the dial to lock it, and slid the oil painting back into place. She had everything she needed: the financial records of his embezzlement, the proof of his medical fraud. The spiderweb Victor had spent 5 years spinning was now in her hands, and she was about to tear it to shreds. Before she left, Clara walked over to Victor's massive mahogany desk. It was perfectly clean, arranged with exact precision. She peeled the sterile blue surgical glove off her right hand. With deliberate care, she laid the blue glove flat in the exact center of his leather desk blotter. It sat there under the moonlight filtering through the blinds, glowing like a silent, terrifying promise. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Victor Vance strode into his office, a cup of expensive coffee in his hand, feeling like the king of the world. In 48 hours, he would be standing on a stage, accepting $100 million from Richard Sterling. His legacy would be cemented forever. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, and took a sip of his coffee. As he walked around his desk to sit down, he froze. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor and shattering, splashing hot brown liquid across his expensive Italian shoes. Right in the center of his desk, disturbing the perfect symmetry of his workspace, lay a single, pristine blue surgical glove. Victor's heart seized in his chest, a cold spike of pure terror driving straight down his spine. He knew that glove. He knew the specific powder-free brand. He knew the color. It was the exact glove Clara used to wear in the operating room. He whipped his head toward the oil painting. It looked undisturbed. He rushed over, shoved the painting aside, and frantically spun the dial to his safe. He opened it. The money was there. The gun was there. The black notebook was there. Nothing had been stolen. But Victor couldn't breathe. Because a common thief steals money, only a ghost leaves a calling card. He backed away from the safe, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting to the shadowy corners of his office. He remembered the phone call from the middle of the night. He remembered her chillingly calm voice. "Tell Evelyn to watch her step." Victor stared at the blue glove on his desk, his arrogance crumbling into ash. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that the woman he thought he had buried 5 years ago wasn't dead. She had just been waiting in the dark, and now the doctor was in. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was a temple built for the worship of wealth and ego. Tonight it was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, celebrating the 50th anniversary of St. Jude's Medical Center. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated through a sea of black tuxedos and glittering designer gowns, carrying silver trays of champagne and beluga caviar. The air was thick with the scent of expensive French perfume, the soft hum of a string quartet, and the intoxicating buzz of high society networking. Dozens of press photographers lined the velvet ropes near the main stage, their camera lenses gleaming like the eyes of hungry insects waiting for the main event. At the center of it all, basking in the flashbulbs, stood Victor Vance. He looked every inch the conquering king. He wore a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than most of his nursing staff made in a year. In his right hand he held a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon. His left arm was wrapped possessively around the waist of Evelyn, who was poured into a shimmering, backless ruby-red gown. Tonight was the night Victor transcended from a mere hospital administrator to a titan of the city. Behind him, on the massive digital screens flanking the stage, the logo of the Sterling Foundation slowly rotated next to the St. Jude's crest. In less than 20 minutes, Richard Sterling was scheduled to walk onto that stage and publicly sign a $100 million endowment. "Look at them, Victor," Evelyn murmured, taking a sip of champagne and gesturing slightly with her manicured hand toward the crowd of admiring doctors and board members. "They're practically bowing. After tonight, the board will give you absolute operational control. We've won." Victor took a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. His eyes scanned the room, looking for Richard Sterling, but the billionaire had not yet made his grand entrance. "Of course we won," Victor said smoothly, though a tiny muscle twitched near his jaw. For the past 48 hours, he had been fighting a cold, creeping paranoia. The blue surgical glove left on his desk had rattled him to his core. He had doubled his personal security, changed the code on his safe, and scoured the hospital security footage. But the cameras in his wing had been mysteriously disabled for a 10-minute window during the night. He had tried to tell himself it was a prank, a sick, twisted joke played by a disgruntled employee. Clara was a broken, penniless janitor. She didn't have the resources to bypass his security, let alone breach his safe. She was nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, a booming voice echoed over the PA system, cutting through the chatter. If you would please direct your attention to the main entrance, it is my great honor to introduce our most esteemed guest of the evening, the founder of the Sterling Foundation, Mr. Richard Sterling. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation evaporated into an expectant, breathless silence. The press photographers raised their cameras, fingers hovering over the shutter buttons. At the far end of the ballroom, the massive gold-leafed double doors were pulled open by two uniformed guards. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Richard Sterling stepped into the ballroom. He was a force of nature, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying authority in a classic black tuxedo. But it wasn't the billionaire who caused the collective, audible gasp to ripple through the room. It was the woman walking beside him. Her hand rested lightly on Richard's arm, not seeking support but simply claiming her space. Victor's crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, the expensive wine splashing onto Evelyn's ruby-red heels. Victor couldn't breathe. The air in his lungs had turned to lead. It was Clara. But this was not the defeated, exhausted woman in faded blue scrubs who scrubbed the toilets of his hospital. This was not the broken ex-wife he had crushed in court. Clara Vance looked like an avenging angel carved from black marble. She wore a floor-length, midnight black evening gown. The cut was masterfully sharp and architectural, with a high neckline and long sleeves that spoke of power rather than vanity. Her dark hair was swept back into an immaculate, elegant twist. There was no heavy jewelry, no flashy diamonds to distract from her face. She didn't need diamonds. Her eyes were the only weapons she needed. They were cold, calm, and utterly lethal. She walked with the precise, commanding posture of a chief surgeon entering an operating theater. Every step was measured. Every movement was deliberate. As she moved through the parted crowd, seasoned doctors who had ignored her as a janitor for 5 years suddenly found themselves shrinking back, instinctively recognizing the alpha in the room. "Victor?" Evelyn hissed, grabbing his arm, her perfectly painted lips trembling. "Victor, what is she doing here? Why is she with him?" Victor's mind was short-circuiting. Pure, unadulterated panic flooded his veins. He looked at the flashing cameras. He looked at the board members whispering frantically to each other. This was his night, his coronation. And she was ruining it just by existing. He had to take control. He was the chief executive. "Security!" Victor shouted, his voice cracking slightly, breaking the sophisticated silence of the room. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "Security, stop that woman immediately. She is an intruder." 2 large security guards in suits stepped forward, but before they could even reach for Clara, Richard Sterling's massive personal bodyguards flanked her, staring the hotel security down with a look that promised instant hospitalization. The hotel guards wisely stepped back. Richard and Clara stopped at the edge of the stage. Victor rushed forward, his face flushed an ugly mottled red. He abandoned all pretense of high society etiquette. The blue glove on his desk suddenly made terrifying sense. "Richard, what is the meaning of this?" Victor demanded, trying to sound authoritative but sounding remarkably like a cornered rat. "This woman is a trespassing, disgruntled former employee. She's a janitor. She has a history of severe mental instability. She is not welcome here." The press cameras were flashing like strobe lights, capturing every drop of sweat on Victor's forehead. Evelyn, desperate to save the situation, stepped up beside Victor, forcing a tight plastic smile. "Mr. Sterling, please forgive the disruption. This woman is Victor's ex-wife. She lost her medical license years ago due to gross negligence and has harbored a sick obsession with destroying Victor ever since. She cleans the floors in our basement. We need to have her escorted out before she causes a scene and embarrasses your foundation." The entire ballroom held its breath. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not scream. She did not defend herself against Evelyn's venom or Victor's frantic accusations. She simply stood there, an immovable mountain of dignity. She looked at Victor not with anger but with the clinical, detached pity a scientist reserves for a dying insect on a microscope slide. "Victor," Richard Sterling finally spoke, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent room. "Dr. Vance is not an intruder. She is my personal guest of honor. And as of this morning, She is the newly appointed Supreme Medical Advisor to the Sterling Foundation. A shockwave of murmurs ripped through the crowd of doctors and executives. Dr. Vance, the Supreme Medical Advisor? Victor's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. Furthermore, Richard continued, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits, I am not here tonight to sign an endowment, Victor. I am here to perform an amputation. The Sterling Foundation does not invest in rot. Victor stumbled backward, bumping into the podium. Richard, Mr. Sterling. I don't understand, we have an agreement. The board has approved the expansion. Everything is in order. Is it? Richard asked softly. He turned to Clara, offering her a slight, respectful nod. Dr. Vance, the floor is yours. This was the moment, the climax of 5 years of agony, of scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, of crying in the dark for her stolen daughter. A lesser person would have taken the microphone and screamed. They would have yelled about the injustice, the pain, the betrayal. But Clara was a surgeon, and a surgeon's most powerful tool is precision. She didn't even touch the microphone. She simply reached into the small black clutch she held and pulled out a small, sleek remote control. She looked Victor dead in the eye and pressed a single button. Immediately, the massive digital screens behind the stage, the ones meant to display the glorious partnership between Victor and the Foundation, flickered. The St. Jude's logo vanished. In its place, a massive, high-definition spreadsheet appeared. The collective gasp from the room was deafening. It was the bank records. Not the hospital's official ledgers, but the hidden Cayman Island accounts. The screen displayed, in towering 50-foot numbers, the exact routing numbers, the dates, and the millions of dollars transferred directly from the Pediatric Leukemia Fund into an offshore account registered to Evelyn Vance. Turn it off. Victor shrieked, spinning around to look at the screen, his eyes bulging. Turn that off. It's fake. She hacked the system. It's a forgery. Clara pressed the button again. The screen shifted. Now it displayed a series of emails. They were intimate, graphic, and highly incriminating emails between Victor and Evelyn, dated 2 years before his divorce from Clara. But the scandal of the affair was nothing compared to the attachments. The emails explicitly discussed manipulating the hospital board, inflating vendor contracts, and funneling the excess cash to pay for Evelyn's summer home in Aspen. Evelyn let out a high-pitched, hysterical wail, covering her face with her hands as the press cameras went into a blinding frenzy, documenting every piece of evidence on the screen. You crazy beach, Victor screamed, losing his mind entirely. He lunged toward Clara, his fists clenched, ready to physically attack her. He didn't make it 2 steps. Richard's bodyguards stepped forward, grabbing Victor by the shoulders and slamming him face first onto the polished mahogany stage. Get your hands off me, I am the chief executive. Victor roared, his cheek pressed against the hard wood, his expensive tuxedo riding up his back. Clara took a slow, measured step forward. She looked down at him. She pressed the button on the remote one final time. The screen changed to a single high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of a battered black leather-bound notebook. The image was zoomed in on a specific page. It was Victor's original surgical log from 5 years ago. His handwriting, his signature, documenting his direct order to bypass the equipment safety protocols, the exact order that had killed a child and destroyed Clara's life. The room fell into a horrifying absolute silence. Every doctor in the room, every board member who had turned a blind eye, stared at the screen. The indisputable proof of medical murder, and a framed innocent woman hung above them like a guillotine. Clara spoke for the first time, her voice echoing perfectly through the stunned silence of the ballroom. It was calm, chilling, and completely devoid of mercy. That is the truth you buried, Victor. But you forgot one thing. A body buried in a shallow grave never stays hidden. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom burst open again. This time it wasn't a billionaire. It was a squad of uniformed police officers led by 2 stern-faced detectives in trench coats. Victor Vance and Evelyn Vance, the lead detective announced, his voice booming over the chaos as they marched down the center aisle. You are under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, corporate fraud, and medical manslaughter. Do not move. Evelyn collapsed onto the floor, sobbing hysterically, her ruby-red dress pooling around her like spilled blood as a female officer roughly pulled her arms behind her back and clamped cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. The guards released Victor, allowing the detectives to haul him to his feet. His perfect hair was disheveled, his face was streaked with sweat and tears of pure terror. He was shivering violently. He looked exactly like the pathetic, hollow man he had always been underneath the expensive suits. As the detective snapped the cuffs onto Victor's wrists, Victor locked eyes with Clara. His eyes were wide, frantic, begging for a mercy he had never shown her. "Clara, please Clara, they'll take Lily." "What about Lily? You can't do this to her father." Clara stepped up to him. The police officers, sensing the gravity of the moment, paused for just a second. Clara leaned in close, the scent of her subtle, clean perfume replacing the stench of his panicked sweat. She didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She leaned down to his ear and whispered a sentence that would haunt him every single night as he lay in his concrete cell for the rest of his life. "I told you, Victor," she whispered, her voice as sharp and cold as a scalpel. "A surgeon's hands never shake." She stepped back. She did not watch as they dragged him out of the ballroom. She did not watch Evelyn screaming as she was led away in front of 100 flashing cameras. Clara Vance simply turned her back to the stage, looked at Richard Sterling, and offered him a small, genuine smile. The cancer had been excised. The patient was finally going to live. The collapse of Victor Vance's empire did not happen slowly. It shattered overnight, like a fragile glass castle hit by a wrecking ball. Before the police cruiser carrying Victor and Evelyn even reached the downtown precinct, the board of directors at St. Jude's Medical Center had convened an emergency meeting to officially terminate him. The media frenzy the next morning was absolute. For weeks, the city was captivated by the sheer audacity of the crime, and more importantly, by the quiet, unbreakable woman who had brought the giant to his knees. The criminal trial was less of a legal battle and more of a public execution. Clara's meticulously reassembled shredded documents, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the high-definition photographs of the original surgical log left the defense attorneys with absolutely nothing. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save themselves, Victor and Evelyn turned on each other, like starving wolves, screaming accusations across the courtroom. It didn't save them. The judge, thoroughly disgusted by their exploitation of a pediatric charity, handed down maximum federal sentences. Victor Vance, a man who had once worn $5,000 suits and played God with the lives of children, was stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his dignity. As the heavy iron doors of the maximum security penitentiary slammed shut behind him, he was left with nothing but a concrete cell and the haunting, inescapable memory of a single blue surgical glove. But for Clara, the destruction of her enemies was merely the clearing of the storm. The true victory, the only victory that had ever mattered, was waiting for her in the sunshine. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the gala. The air in the private walled gardens of the Sterling estate was thick with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and the gentle warmth of the early spring sun. Clara stood near a stone fountain, her hands trembling. She was not wearing a janitor's uniform, nor a black evening gown. She wore a simple, elegant ivory blouse and soft trousers. She looked like a woman who had finally woken up from a long, suffocating nightmare. She heard the soft crunch of gravel on the pathway behind her. Clara turned around, her breath catching so sharply it ached in her chest. Walking down the garden path, holding the hand of a kindly family court social worker, was a 7-year-old girl in a bright yellow sundress. She had a smattering of freckles across her nose and bright, beautiful hazel eyes. Lily stopped. She dropped the social worker's hand. For a second that felt like a lifetime, mother and daughter just stared at each other across the manicured lawn. 5 years of forced separation, of whispered lies, of missed birthdays and stolen bedtimes hung in the air between them. "Mommy?" Lily whispered, her voice fragile as if she were afraid this was just another dream she would wake up from. Clara dropped to her knees on the grass, not caring about the dirt. She held her arms open wide, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I'm here, my sweet girl. Mommy is right here." Lily ran. The little girl practically flew across the grass, throwing her small arms around Clara's neck with a force that knocked them both backward. Clara buried her face in her daughter's soft hair, breathing in the scent of strawberries and sunshine, wrapping her arms around the tiny body, as if she were trying to shield her from the entire universe. "I told you I was coming for you," Clara sobbed, rocking her daughter back and forth on the grass, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her hair. "I promised you. I'm never ever letting you go again." "I knew you would come," Lily cried into Clara's shoulder, her small hands gripping Clara's shirt with desperate strength. "I knew you weren't bad. I missed you so much, Mommy. I have you. We are safe now." "It's over," Clara whispered, the 5-year-old iceberg around her heart finally, completely melting into warm tears of absolute joy. A short distance away, standing on the grand terrace of the estate, Richard Sterling watched the reunion. Beside him stood his son, Leo, perfectly healthy and vibrant, holding a toy airplane. Richard looked at the mother and daughter weeping with joy on the grass, and then he looked down at his own son, resting a large, protective hand on the boy's shoulder. He knew the agonizing terror of almost losing a child. He understood exactly what Clara had fought for. Clara looked up through her tears, her eyes meeting Richard's across the garden. There was no need for grand speeches or formal thank yous. Between the two of them, a silent, profound nod of mutual respect was exchanged. Two parents, fiercely protective, who had walked through the fire for their children and emerged victorious. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly remodeled executive wing at St. Jude's Medical Center. The dark, oppressive mahogany of Victor Vance's era had been completely ripped out, replaced by bright, clean glass and modern, uplifting light. The hospital, now fully funded and operated by the Sterling Foundation, had been entirely purged of its corruption. In a private dressing room attached to the chief medical officer's suite, Clara stood alone. In her hands, she held a folded square of faded, navy blue fabric. It was her old janitor's uniform. The knees were worn thin, the hem was stained with industrial bleach, and it smelled faintly of harsh floor cleaner. It was the physical manifestation of her humiliation, her pain, and her invisible suffering. Without a trace of hesitation, Clara dropped the blue scrubs into the trash bin. She turned to the chair behind her. Draped immaculately over the backrest was a crisp, perfectly tailored, pristine white doctor's coat. Clara slipped her arms into the sleeves. The fabric felt cool, clean, and right. It was a second skin she had been denied for far too long. She reached onto the desk and picked up a gleaming silver magnetic name tag, snapping it onto her left lapel right above her heart. It read, Dr. Clara Vance, Chief Medical Officer. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight and the privilege of the coat settle over her shoulders. She was no longer a ghost haunting the hallways in the dark. She was the light that was going to guide this hospital into a new era. Clara opened the heavy glass door of her office and stepped out into the bustling administrative corridor. Nurses, attending physicians, and staff members were walking briskly, carrying charts and discussing patient care. As Clara walked down the hall, the energy in the corridor shifted. People didn't shrink away in fear like they had under Victor's reign. They stopped, offering warm smiles and nods of genuine, profound respect. Good morning, Dr. Vance, a senior floor nurse smiled, holding a clipboard. Good morning, Sarah, Clara replied, her voice strong, clear, and full of warmth. We have a complex pediatric cardiac consult in room 3 waiting for your review, doctor. Whenever you're ready. Clara smiled, a true radiant smile that reached all the way to her dark, intelligent eyes. She thought of Lily, safe and happy at school. She thought of the long, dark road she had walked to get back to this exact spot. She adjusted her stethoscope around her neck. Her hands, the golden hands that had scrubbed floors and picked locks, the hands that had saved a billionaire's son and destroyed a monster, were perfectly steady. I'm ready, Clara said, walking purposefully down the brightly lit hall. Let's get to work.